What happens when a place of worship becomes a chamber of horror? When sacred walls witness the unthinkable and silence become complicit in evil? Picture this. A young woman enters a church to pray alone. By morning, she's found dead in the most disturbing way imaginable, surrounded by symbols that suggest something far darker than a random crime. This isn't just another murder. This is a puzzle that would haunt investigators for nearly half a century, involving serial killers, satanic cults, and a trail of deception that reaches into the very heart of one of America's most prestigious universities. Tonight, we're diving into a case that will make you question everything you think you know about evil hiding in plain sight. October 12, 1974. Stanford University campus. The air was crisp with autumn's bite, and the towering spires of the Memorial Church cast long shadows across the manicured lawns as evening settled over California's intellectual paradise. 19-year-old Arliss had only been in California for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since she'd left everything familiar behind in North Dakota to follow her husband Bruce to this prestigious campus where he was pursuing his pre-med dreams. She was still adjusting to the weather, to the pace, to being so far from home. But faith was her anchor. It always had been. That evening, something so mundane triggered everything that followed. A disagreement about tire pressure. Such a small thing, isn't it? The kind of marital spat that happens in driveways across America every single day. But this one would be their last. "I need to pray," she told Bruce. Not unusual for Arliss. She was deeply religious, the kind of person who found solace in sacred spaces. The Memorial Church, with its soaring Gothic architecture and stained glass windows, had become her refuge in this new place. Bruce watched her walk away into the darkness, probably thinking she'd be back within the hour. Maybe went inside, made a sandwich, tried to focus on his studies. Young married life, you know? You think you have forever to work out the small disagreements. The church stood silent against the night sky, its massive doors welcoming to those seeking peace. Arliss disappeared inside, swallowed by shadows and sanctuary. Hours passed. Bruce began to pace. 11:30 became midnight. Midnight became 1 in the morning. By 3 a.m., that familiar knot of anxiety was twisting in his stomach. This wasn't like her. Arliss was responsible, predictable. She didn't just vanish. He called the police. The officers who responded were thorough, or so they thought. They circled the Memorial Church, testing every door, peering through windows. Everything was locked tight. No signs of forced entry. No signs of anything amiss. "Are you sure she came here?" they asked Bruce. "All the doors are secure." But somewhere in the darkness behind those locked doors, something terrible was unfolding. Something that would transform this sacred space into a crime scene, so disturbing that even seasoned investigators would struggle to process what they found. Dawn broke slowly over Stanford on October 13th. The campus security guard, a man named Stephen, had worked this beat for years. Ex-cop, steady, reliable. The kind of guy who noticed when something was off. He approached the Memorial Church just before 6 in the morning, keys jangling in the crisp air. Another routine morning. Until it wasn't. The west door hung open. Not just unlocked. Open. Forced from inside, though it splintered around the lock mechanism. Stephen's cop instincts kicked in immediately. This was wrong. Very wrong. He stepped inside, and the vast space swallowed him whole. Gothic arches stretched overhead, and morning light filtered through stained glass, casting colored shadows across the stone floor. The smell hit him first. Something metallic, something that didn't belong in this holy place. Then he saw her, near the altar, in the east transept. Arliss lay motionless beneath a wooden pew. But this wasn't just a body. This was a scene choreographed by madness. Her hands were crossed over her chest in a pose of prayer or death. An ice pick protruded from the back of her skull, though its handle had snapped off and disappeared. There were signs of strangulation around her throat, but it was the other details that made veteran investigators' blood run cold. Arliss was naked from the waist down. A long altar candle, one of those thick, ceremonial ones used in church services, had been inserted into her body. Another candle was placed between her breasts. Her jeans were arranged over her legs in a precise diamond pattern. This wasn't rage. This wasn't passion. This was ritual, the positioning, the symbols, the deliberate arrangement of religious objects. Someone had turned murder into a dark ceremony, using the church itself as their stage. Who does something like this? And more chilling, who has the knowledge, the twisted imagination, to transform a place of worship into something so blasphemous? The investigation that followed would uncover layers of deception, false identities, and connections to some of the most notorious killers in American history. But that morning, as Stephen stood in the colored light streaming through those ancient windows, staring at a scene that would haunt him forever, only one thing was certain. Evil had found its way into paradise. If you believe stories like this should be told, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. The Stanford campus buzzed with whispers within hours. Students walking to morning classes noticed the police cars, the yellow tape, the grim faces of investigators entering and exiting the memorial church. Word spread the way it does in tight communities. Quickly, quietly, with growing dread. But the official investigation was revealing disturbing inconsistencies from the very beginning. Remember Stephen, the security guard who found the body? His story had holes. Big ones. He claimed he'd locked the church just after midnight, noticing nothing unusual inside. He said he'd checked the doors again around 2 a.m., all secure. But when investigators pressed him, that 2 a.m. check turned out to be a lie, a complete fabrication. Why would someone lie about checking a building where a murder occurred? What was Stephen trying to hide about those crucial hours when Arliss was inside, alone and vulnerable? The crime scene itself was yielding clues, but they only deepened the mystery. Investigators found semen on a kneeling cushion near where Arliss was discovered. They lifted a partial palm print from one of the candles used in the ritualistic arrangement. Here's what made it even stranger. Neither the DNA nor the print matched Bruce, Arliss's husband. They didn't match Stephen either, despite his suspicious timeline. So who else was in that church that night? The answer was more complex than anyone imagined. According to witness accounts, at least 7 people had been in or around the memorial church between midnight and dawn. 7 people, moving through those shadows like ghosts. Arliss was one. Stephen was another. But 5 others remained unidentified, including one young man who caught the attention of a passerby just before midnight. Sandy-haired, average build, about 5'10". No watch on his wrist, which seemed oddly specific for someone to notice. He was about to enter the church when the witness spotted him, disappearing into the same darkness that had swallowed Arliss. Who was he? What did he see? Did he encounter Arliss in those final, terrifying moments? The investigation cast a wide net. They looked at Ted Bundy, who was active in the region. They examined connections to other campus murders that had occurred in the previous years. They dove deep into Arliss's background, searching for anyone who might have followed her from North Dakota to California. But then the investigation took a turn into something far stranger than anyone could have imagined. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam Killer, began writing letters from his prison cell in New York. Letters that mentioned Arliss by name. Arliss Perry, he scrawled in jagged capital letters. Hunted, pursued, and killed. Followed to California. How does a serial killer 3,000 miles away know details about a murder he had nothing to do with? What dark channels of information flow between predators, even when they're locked away from the world? The letters painted a picture of satanic cults, of Arliss being targeted for trying to convert devil worshippers back in North Dakota. They spoke of her being followed to California, as if her murder was a culmination of some elaborate cross-country hunt. Was any of it true? Or was this just a fevered imagination of a killer desperate for attention, spinning elaborate fantasies from fragments of news reports? The deeper investigators dug into Arliss's final weeks, the more unsettling coincidences they uncovered. Phone calls to wrong numbers, mix-ups involving another student with the same name as her husband, strange conversations with people who seemed to know too much about their private lives. In one of her final letters home, Arliss had written about these confusing phone calls with an odd mixture of amusement and unease. She laughed about the coincidences, but something in her words suggested she couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to it than simple mistakes. What if someone really had been watching them? What if the ritualistic elements of her murder weren't random, but part of something larger, more organized, more sinister? These questions haunted investigators for years. Every lead seemed to branch into 3 more mysteries. Every answer revealed deeper questions. The deeper investigators dug, the more questions multiplied. Was this a random crime of opportunity? A ritualistic killing by someone obsessed with occult symbolism? Or something more calculated? A targeted elimination carried out by people who've been watching Arliss long, before she ever set foot in California? As the months stretched into years, the case files grew thicker, but the answers remained elusive. The memorial church was reconsecrated. Services resumed. Students graduated and moved on. But in the quiet moments, when morning light filtered through those same stained glass windows, you could almost feel the presence of that terrible night. Somewhere out there, someone knew exactly what had happened in those sacred shadows. Someone who had arranged candles and clothing with ritualistic precision. Someone who had transformed prayer into perversion, sanctuary into slaughter. The question that haunted investigators as the case grew cold wasn't just who had killed Arliss. It was why someone would go to such elaborate, symbolic lengths to ensure her death became a message written in blasphemy and blood, displayed in the holiest place they could find. What were they trying to say? And to whom? The answers were closer than anyone imagined, hidden behind a familiar face that had been part of the story from the very beginning. But it would take revolutionary advances in science and nearly 44 years of waiting before the truth would finally emerge from the shadows. Time as a way of revealing secrets that human cunning tries to bury. By 2018, the world had changed dramatically. DNA analysis had evolved from a primitive investigative tool into something approaching scientific magic. Cold cases that had molded in filing cabinets for decades were suddenly springing back to life as technology caught up to crimes that seemed unsolvable. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office maintained a cold case unit, and Arliss's file was one of their most haunting unsolved puzzles. Every few years, someone would pull it out, spread the crime scene photos across a conference table, and wonder, what had they missed? In early 2018, they decided to take another shot. Advanced DNA testing techniques had become more sensitive, more precise. Perhaps they could extract usable genetic material from evidence that had been considered worthless decades earlier. They focused on that semen sample found on the kneeling cushion near Arliss's body. The sample that hadn't matched Bruce or Stephen, but had been too degraded for primitive testing available in the 70s. Modern science works differently. Where investigators in 1974 saw a useless smear of biological material, 21st century forensic labs saw a genetic fingerprint waiting to be decoded. The DNA results came back with a match, not to some unknown suspect from a national database, not to a serial killer or drifter or cult member. The match was to someone whose name was already in the case file, someone who had been interviewed extensively, someone who had been present at the crime scene and had never been considered a serious suspect. The genetic material belonged to Stephen, the campus security guard who had discovered Arliss's body that October morning. Suddenly, everything shifted into horrifying focus. The man who had called police, who had guided the initial investigation, who had been treated as a witness rather than a suspect, he was the killer. Think about the psychological audacity required for something like this. Stephen hadn't just committed murder. He had positioned himself as a hero of his own crime. He had found the body, expressed shock and concern, helped investigators understand the timeline. For 44 years, he had lived with the knowledge that he had fooled everyone. But DNA doesn't lie, and it doesn't forget. On June 28, 2018, investigators arrived at Stephen's residence on Camden Avenue in San Jose with a search warrant. They expected to arrest a man, perhaps get a confession, finally close a case that had haunted the apartment for nearly half a century. They found the front door, knocked, announced themselves. Standard procedure for serving a warrant. Then they heard the gunshot. Stephen had chosen suicide over capture. Even at the very end, he maintained control over his narrative. He would never be questioned, never be forced to explain what had happened in that church, never give Arliss's family the answers they deserved. The investigation into his death revealed no prior connection between Stephen and Arliss. She was from Bismarck, North Dakota. He was a local ex-cop turned security guard. Their paths had intersected only in those final, terrifying moments when she sought solace in prayer, and he transformed her sanctuary into a chamber of horrors. This raises perhaps the most disturbing question of all. If Stephen had no personal connection to Arliss, what drove him to commit such an elaborate ritualistic murder? Why the candles, the precise positioning, the blasphemous symbolism? Psychologists who study violent crime talk about something called signature behavior, the unique psychological elements that killers leave at crime scenes not because they're necessary for murder, but because they fulfill some deep, twisted psychological need. The signature is a part of the crime that reveals the killer's inner darkness. Stephen's signature was desecration. He didn't just kill Arliss. He violated everything sacred about her death. The church setting, the religious symbols, the careful arrangement of her body. He was making a statement about the corruption of innocence, the destruction of faith. But here's what makes it even more chilling. Stephen maintained his facade for over 4 decades. He continued working security, interacting with students, walking past that same church where he committed an act of ultimate evil. He attended community events, probably shook hands with police officers, maybe even discussed the unsolved murder with colleagues. How do you carry that kind of secret? How do you look at yourself in the mirror every morning knowing what you've done? The answer reveals something fundamental about the nature of evil. It doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a uniform, carries a badge, speaks with a voice of authority and concern. Sometimes the person asking, "How can I help?" is the same person who created the problem in the first place. Stephen's suicide eliminated any possibility of understanding his motives, but also revealed something crucial about his psychology. Even after all those years, even facing the inevitability of exposure, he refused to surrender control. He chose the time, place, and manner of his final act. This is a hallmark of a particular type of killer, the need to orchestrate, to manipulate, to remain the author of his own story even when that story is ending. But what about all those other threads that had tangled the investigation for so long? The Berkowitz letters, the phone number confusion, the mysterious 7-person at the church? Most of them dissolved under scrutiny. Berkowitz's knowledge of the case likely came from news reports and his own twisted imagination. The phone number mix-up was probably just one of those strange coincidences that seem meaningful only in retrospect. The unidentified witnesses may have been students taking shortcuts across campus or couples looking for privacy. Stephen had hidden in plain sight for 44 years by doing something psychologically brilliant. He had made himself indispensable to the investigation. Who questions the person who found the body? Who suspects the man whose job it was to protect the campus? The revelation of his guilt recontextualized everything. His lies about checking the church at 2 a.m. weren't the confused memories of a stressed witness. They were deliberate misdirection from someone who knew exactly what had happened and when. His detailed knowledge of the crime scene wasn't the result of careful observation. It was the intimate familiarity of the perpetrator. Most disturbing of all, his presence at the scene the next morning wasn't coincidence or bad luck. Stephen had returned to admire his work, to insert himself into the investigation, to experience the thrill of watching others struggle to understand what he had done. This behavior, returning to the crime scene, involving oneself in the investigation, is more common among certain types of killers than most people realize. They're driven by a need to relive the crime, to maintain some level of control over its aftermath, to prove their intellectual superiority over the investigators. Stephen must have felt incredibly clever during those early interviews, answering questions about timeline and procedures, while knowing that he was the answer to every question they were asking. The psychological gratification of that deception probably sustained him for years. But technology caught up, science evolved, and in the end, the biological evidence he left behind became his undoing. The resolution of Arliss's case illustrates both the power of modern forensic science and its limitations. DNA gave investigators the who, but it couldn't provide the why. It identified the killer, but couldn't resurrect him to explain his motives. We're left with questions that will never be answered. Was this Stephen's only crime, or were there other victims whose cases were never connected to him? How long had he been planning something like this? Did he specifically target Arliss, or was she simply in the wrong place when his violent fantasies demanded expression? The case also reveals how evil can hide behind the most mundane facades. Stephen wasn't a drifter or an obvious psychopath. He was a former police officer, a security guard, someone entrusted with protecting the very community he victimized. He wore the uniform protection while harboring the impulses of predation. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire story. We want our monsters to look like monsters, to announce themselves with obvious warning signs, to be easily identifiable and therefore avoidable. But real evil is often more subtle, more patient, more sophisticated. Stephen Crawford walked among the Stanford community for decades after murdering Arliss, trusted with the safety of students, perhaps even discussing campus security measures designed to prevent the very type of crime he had committed. The irony is both tragic and terrifying. For Arliss' family and friends, the identification of her killer brought a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. After 44 years of wondering, they finally had an answer, but they also had to confront the reality that the person responsible had lived freely for nearly half a century, while Arliss remained frozen in time. Forever 19, forever the young woman who had simply wanted to pray alone in a church. Her story becomes more than just a crime narrative. It becomes a meditation on the persistence of evil, the power of truth, and the way technology can reach across decades to deliver justice when human efforts have failed. In the end, Arliss wasn't just hunted, pursued, and killed, as Berkowitz had written in his twisted letters. She was remembered, honored, and ultimately avenged by investigators who refused to let her case disappear into bureaucratic darkness of unsolved files. The memorial church at Stanford still stands, still welcomes worshipers seeking peace and solace. The stained glass windows still cast colored light across the stone floors where Arliss died. But now there's something else in that sacred space. The knowledge that evil was exposed, that truth prevailed, that even most carefully hidden secrets eventually surface. Sometimes justice takes 44 years to arrive. Sometimes it comes only after the guilty have escaped earthly punishment. But it comes nonetheless, carried on the double helix of DNA and the determination of people who refuse to let evil have the last word. The next time you enter a place of worship, a place where you expect to find safety and sanctuary, remember Arliss. Remember that evil can infiltrate even our most sacred spaces. But also remember that truth has a way of emerging from the shadows, no matter how long it takes. And remember this: the person sitting next to you, the person in uniform, the person who seems most helpful and concerned, any of them could be carrying secrets that would horrify you. Evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs. It hides behind familiar faces, trusted positions, and helpful gestures. The most disturbing truth about the human condition is how well we can disguise our darkest impulses, how expertly we can perform normalcy while harboring thoughts that would make others recoil in horror. But perhaps there's comfort in knowing that eventually, almost inevitably, the truth finds a way to surface. Technology evolves, investigations persist, and secrets that seem perfectly hidden reveal themselves to the patient and the determined. Arliss went to church that October night, seeking communion with the divine. Instead, she encountered something far more earthly and far more evil. But in the end, her story became a testament to the power of truth, the persistence of justice, and the way light eventually penetrates even the darkest corners of human behavior. The shadows that swallowed her that night eventually gave up their secrets. The evil that thought it had hidden perfectly was ultimately exposed. And the young woman who simply wanted to pray was finally, after 44 years, given the justice she deserved. That's how we honor the victims, by refusing to let their stories end with the violence done to them, by insisting that truth matters, that justice matters, that remembering matters. Arliss K. Perry was 19 years old when she died, but her story didn't end in that church. It continued in every interview, every DNA test, every moment when investigators refused to give up. Her story continues now, in the telling, in the remembering, in the insistence that evil should never be allowed to write the final chapter. What happens when a place of worship becomes a chamber of horror? The answer isn't just about the evil that enters those sacred spaces. It's about the light that eventually drives the darkness away, the truth that outlasts the lies, and the justice that arrives even when it takes nearly half a century to find its way home.